At dawn on a cold March morning, a river that had learned to behave was told to remember how to rage. High above the Colorado River, on the rim of a concrete wall anchored into ancient stone, engineers stood in silence and prepared to reverse decades of restraint. Below them stretched a canyon carved by persistence rather than force, shaped not by single moments but by the patient repetition of water over millions of years. For most of its existence, this place had known long seasons of dryness broken by brief, violent floods. That rhythm had ended within a single human lifetime. On that morning, it was summoned back. When the first jet tube opened, the river did not respond gently. Water burst from the dam with a whiteness that erased detail, collapsing into itself as it struck the channel below. It did not flow so much as detonate. The sound traveled through the canyon walls, reverberating through rock older than complex life. As more gates opened, the controlled release turned into something that felt less controlled, a surge that rose against the stone and began to climb. The river lifted itself 16 feet higher than its accustomed line, flooding terraces that had not felt moving water since the dam's completion. In a place long reduced to heat and dust, the ground began to shake. This was not a natural disaster, it was a deliberate act, planned down to the minute and measured by instruments, yet driven by uncertainty. Never before had humans attempted to recreate a flood of this scale on purpose. For 9 hours, water bypassed the turbines meant to convert its force into electricity and instead poured directly into the canyon, carrying with it sand and silt that had been trapped for decades behind concrete. Millions of tons of sediment were lifted and carried downstream, scouring the riverbed and repainting the water a deep, ancient red. For 1 week, the Colorado moved as it once had, unconcerned with schedules or grids, answering only gravity. The canyon absorbed the shock in silence. Car-sized boulders shifted, banks collapsed and reformed, beaches that had thinned to nothingness began to return, spreading soft margins along a corridor that had hardened into stone. The river, once stripped to clarity, became opaque again, thick with memory. From above, the flood traced a dark, living line through the desert, visible even from orbit. It was a reminder that beneath the layers of management and measurement, the river still possessed the capacity to rearrange the world around it. This moment did not arise from abundance, it was born of loss. When the Glen Canyon Dam was completed in the early 1960s, it sealed off more than a river. It interrupted a process that had shaped the interior of a continent. Behind the dam, Lake Powell spread outward, flooding side canyons and burying landscapes that had never known still water. Below it, the Colorado was transformed into something thinner and colder, deprived of the sediment that had once defined its character. Over time, the river began to eat away at its own foundations, eroding beaches faster than they could be replaced. Scientists called it hungry water, a term that suggested appetite without nourishment, motion without renewal. For thousands of years before the dam, spring floods had arrived with snowmelt from distant mountains. They came predictably, yet with enough force to rearrange the canyon's margins each year. Sandbars rose and fell, cottonwood seeds found fresh ground, and fish adapted to cycles of chaos and calm. Human communities learned these rhythms and built their lives around them. Fields were planted near the water's edge. Trails followed the contours shaped by flood and retreat. The river was not merely a resource, but a pulse, a seasonal certainty in an otherwise unforgiving land. The dam broke that pulse. Water levels downstream began to rise and fall according to human demand rather than snowpack. Power generation required daily fluctuations, sudden releases in the morning and reductions at night. To the canyon, this was a kind of stuttering, a constant instability that replaced the long, singular surges of the past. Beaches vanished, invasive plants took root in the absence of scouring floods. Native species, evolved for unpredictability, began to decline in a river that had become strangely consistent. The decision to unleash a flood in 1996 was an attempt to correct a mistake without undoing it. Engineers and ecologists hoped that a single, massive release could mimic the effects of years of natural flooding. They watched carefully for signs of failure, both in the canyon walls and within the dam itself. The memory of 1983 lingered, when uncontrolled spillway releases during an extreme snowmelt had nearly destroyed the structure. That summer, water had rushed through auxiliary tunnels at unprecedented speeds, tearing concrete from their walls and gouging the surrounding sandstone. The river below had turned red not just from sediment, but from the canyon itself being torn open. That near catastrophe revealed a deeper truth. Water moving at extreme speed becomes something else. Cavitation bubbles form and collapse with explosive force, capable of breaking stone and steel. In 1983, those invisible detonations had threatened the integrity of the dam, exposing how close control could come to collapse. Repairs were made, lessons learned, and the structure survived. Yet the episode underscored the fragility of mastery. The river could still overwhelm its constraints. When the planned flood of 1996 subsided, the canyon bore new marks. Fresh sand covered eroded banks. Invasive vegetation had been stripped away in places, replaced by open ground ready for renewal. Fish habitats shifted, some improving, others destabilized. The effects were uneven and temporary, but undeniable. For a brief time, the river resembled itself again. It carried weight, it moved with purpose. Scientists saw in this transformation a confirmation of something long understood by those who had lived with the river for millennia. Disorder was not a flaw, it was a requirement. Subsequent experiments refined the approach. High-flow releases were timed to follow periods when tributaries delivered fresh sediment into the main channel. Cameras and sensors tracked the movement of sand in real time, allowing managers to release water only when there was something worth moving. These were not floods meant to conquer the canyon, but to converse with it, to speak in a language the river still understood. Each release was a negotiation between risk and restoration, between the need to protect infrastructure and the need to preserve something far older. Beneath these calculations lay a deeper concern. Along the canyon's margins, tucked into alcoves and terraces, are the remains of human lives lived long before concrete and turbines. Stone dwellings, storage pits, trails, and carved panels record thousands of years of presence. Some of these sites date back more than 9 millennia, predating the earliest cities of the Old World. They are fragile, held together by mortar and memory, protected not by walls, but by layers of sand deposited over generations. When the dam trapped sediment upstream, it did more than starve beaches. It exposed these sites to wind and rain, accelerating their decay. Without periodic floods to replenish protective layers of sand, walls began to crumble, and artifacts emerged only to be eroded away. The experimental floods, by redistributing sediment onto higher banks, offered a form of preservation. Sand blown upward by receding water acted as a blanket, shielding the past from the present. In this way, the release of water became an act of care, not just for ecosystems, but for history itself. Indigenous communities have long understood the river as a keeper of stories. Its channels trace routes of migration and survival. Its floods mark time not by calendars, but by generations. To disturb its flow is to disturb a record written in stone and soil. The modern effort to restore flooding, imperfect and costly as it is, acknowledges this continuity. It accepts that the river's value cannot be measured solely in megawatts or acre-feet, but in the persistence of memory. Yet each release carries a price. Water sent through bypass tubes does not generate power. Every high-flow experiment reduces the dam's output, forcing energy systems to compensate elsewhere. Over time, the losses accumulate, measured not only in dollars but in confidence. The river's management exists within a web of competing needs, each pressing against the others. Agriculture depends on predictable deliveries. Cities demand constant supply. Ecosystems require disruption. History requires protection. None of these demands can be fully satisfied without compromising another. As the decades pass, a larger uncertainty looms. The American West is entering a period of dryness unprecedented in recorded history. Tree rings and sediment cores reveal cycles of drought that dwarfed anything seen since modern settlement. Snowpacks shrink, reservoirs recede. Lake Powell itself has fallen to levels that expose the scars of its creation, drowned canyons re-emerging as mud and stone. Engineers speak quietly of dead pool, the point at which water can no longer pass through the dam at all, rendering it a monument to a promise that can no longer be kept. During years of scarcity, experimental floods are the first to be sacrificed. Without surplus water, there is no margin for restoration. The river below the dam slows, vegetation creeps back, and sandbars thin once more. When a heavy winter finally arrives, as it did in the early 2020s, a brief window opens. Another release follows, celebrated cautiously, aware that it may be the last for some time. Each flood now feels provisional, a temporary reprieve rather than a return to normal. Alongside these tangible struggles, more speculative narratives persist. Stories circulate of hidden chambers and submerged passages, of canyons holding secrets older than recorded history. Such tales flourish in places shaped by depth and shadow, where rock walls conceal more than they reveal. Whether grounded in fact or not, they speak to a broader unease, the sense that the river's manipulation has obscured something essential, that control has come at the cost of understanding. More grounded and more troubling is the arithmetic of dependence. Tens of millions of people draw their lives from the Colorado River. Fields that feed a nation rely on its regulated flow. Cities in arid basins expand under the assumption that water will continue to arrive, diverted and stored according to agreements drafted in a wetter century. Those agreements promised more water than the river has ever consistently provided. The imbalance was masked by reservoirs and dams, by the illusion of stability. Now, as the climate shifts, the illusion fades. Geologists add another layer of concern. The immense weight of water stored behind dams presses down on the Earth's crust, subtly altering stress along fault lines. This phenomenon, known as reservoir-induced seismicity, has been observed elsewhere. In the case of Lake Powell, some suggest that rapid changes in water level could influence seismic behavior in the surrounding region. The idea that the dam might not only restrain water, but also stabilize stone, introduces a new dimension to decisions about its future. Draining the reservoir to restore the river could carry risks as profound as keeping it filled. In this context, the choice to release a flood becomes more than an environmental experiment. It is a gesture toward balance in a system increasingly defined by imbalance. It acknowledges that control has limits, that the river's long history cannot be fully rewritten without consequence. Each surge of water carries echoes of past floods, of seasons when the canyon reshaped itself without permission or oversight. It also carries the weight of present uncertainty, the knowledge that such moments may grow rarer as scarcity deepens. If the river were to fall silent, the canyon would not vanish, but it would change in ways that are difficult to reverse. The sound of water against stone would fade, species adapted to current and turbidity would disappear, cottonwoods would die, taking their shade with them. The canyon floor would heat, becoming hostile even to those who know it well. Human presence, drawn for centuries by the promise of water, would retreat.
The river's absence would be a different kind of monument, one defined by what no longer moves. The experimental floods do not promise salvation, they offer continuity, a way to keep the river's story unfolding rather than ending abruptly. Each release is an admission that the past still matters, that processes set in motion long before dams and treaties continue to shape the present. In sending a wall of water through the Grand Canyon, humans briefly step back from the role of master and assume that of participant, intervening not to dominate, but to remember. When the gates close and the river settles back into its constrained channel, traces of the flood remain. Sand lies where there was rock, sites once exposed are covered again. The water carries less sediment, then clears, resuming its regulated course. The canyon absorbs these changes as it always has, layering them onto a record millions of years in the making. The decision to flood becomes another stratum, thin but significant, marking a moment when restraint was loosened in acknowledgement of something older and larger. The river continues, altered but alive, moving between walls that have witnessed oceans rise and fall, species emerge and vanish, climates swing between extremes. Human interventions, monumental as they seem, occupy only a narrow band in this deep timeline. The floods of the past shaped the canyon without intention. The floods of the present are shaped by intention without certainty. Between them lies a shared recognition of power, not as something to be held indefinitely, but as something that must occasionally be released. As the Colorado flows on, carrying fragments of stone and memory towards a sea it may or may not reach, the canyon waits. It has endured dryness before, and will endure again. The question is not whether the river will remember how to flood, but whether those who control its gates will remember why it once did and what was lost when it stopped.